Heading into week 5 of the fantasy football season, here's a few quarterbacks I looked at on waivers this week. The first guy is Sam Darnold of the Carolina Panthers. So what a first 4 games of the season it's been for Sam Darnold with his new team in Carolina. And he looks totally different than he was with the New York Jets. He actually has weapons. He actually has a good head coach that knows how to run an offense around Darnold. And right now he's been one of the best fantasy quarterbacks so far in the early going, the first few games of the season. Week 1 versus the Jets, 279 yards, a touchdown passing and a rushing touchdown, a fumble loss. Week 2 versus the New Orleans Saints, 305 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and an 8. Week 3 at Houston, 304 passing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. And week 4 at the Dallas Cowboys, another big game for Darnold, over 300 yards, 301 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 2 windows with 35 yards added rushing. So this week in week 5 here, he's got another plus matchup versus a weak Philadelphia Eagle team that's been getting carved up by opposing quarterbacks so far this season. Darnold right now, he's available in 63% of fantasy leagues, and he's definitely a quarterback. I would go out there and add in 12-team leagues or deeper because he's getting the job done. He leads the league in rushing touchdowns for quarterbacks with 5, and it's been a great change of scenery and a season for him so far. The next quarterback I looked at on the wire this week is Daniel Jones of the New York Giants. So it's an every other week type of thing here with Daniel Jones. A few weeks ago I said to pick him up. Then I said drop him last week. But now this week I'm looking to pick him up at the Dallas Cowboys. This Dallas Cowboy defense, they do make some defensive plays, but opposing quarterbacks still score the 7th most fantasy points versus the Cowboys. So Daniel Jones this season, he's had a pretty good year. In his latest game at the New Orleans Saints, 402 passing yards, 2 touchdowns in it, 27 rushing, and a 2-point conversion. So that was good in that ball game for Daniel Jones. 35 fantasy points here. So he's having a good season fantasy-wise. I know the Giants are struggling 1-3, but he definitely could get the job done. And he's got 3 games out of the first 4 this year with 25 or more fantasy points. So this week versus the Dallas Cowboys in a game where I think it's going to be an NFC East type of shootout because the Cowboys always get into these high-scoring games. I think Daniel Jones could be a good option at quarterback this week, and definitely an ad available in 69% of fantasy leagues. The next quarterback's Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons, they haven't had a good season so far, 1-3 on the year. But Matt Ryan, the last 3 games here since week 2, he's really stepped his game up and been fantasy worthy. Week 2 at Tampa, 300 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 at those, 3 rushing yards, a 2-point conversion. Week 3 at the Giants, 243 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and a fumble loss. In week 4 versus the Washington football team, he went off 283 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, and 17 yards rushing, even though they lost a tough one, 34-30. And this week here, week 5, he's got a good matchup versus the New York Jets. That teams offensively pretty much have their way. And I know the Jets just came off a victory versus the Tennessee Titans. But here, Matt Ryan, he's finding some new weapons in this offense with Julio Jones obviously gone in Tennessee. And Cordell Patterson's been a godsend here for Matt Ryan in this offense, or he really would be struggling. He had Patterson for 3 touchdowns in week 4, and right now he's pretty much his number 1 target, even over Calvin Ridley, it seems like, over the last few weeks. So right here, Matt Ryan, he's still available in a great 47% of fantasy leagues, and what a good matchup in week 5. I would give him an ad. The next quarterback's Taylor Heinicke of the Washington football team. So last week I recommended to add him on waivers, and he didn't disappoint once again with a 36-point fantasy day in week 4 is Heinicke versus the Falcons. 290 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 43 rushing yards. So this guy so far, the first 3 games he started since week 2, he's got over 23 fantasy points or more as Heinicke, and he's got another pretty good matchup here in week 5 versus the New Orleans Saints, who we just saw get carved up by Daniel Jones for 400 yards and a few touchdowns. So Heinicke here, him and this Washington football team, they're either going to be trailing in a lot of games or in a lot of shootouts. And once again, in this game versus New Orleans, I think it's going to be a back-and-forth battle where Heinicke's going to throw the ball a lot. And it wouldn't surprise me to see him once again have 250 to 300 yards in this one with 2 or 3 touchdowns and maybe a couple turnovers. But right now, he's available in 90% of fantasy leagues, and the 5th and final quarterback I've looked at on waivers this week's Trey Lance of the San Francisco 49ers. So Jimmy Garoppolo, another season, another ball game that he leaves here with a calf injury. And Trey Lance, he came in the start of the second half in this ball game, and he had a good fantasy day, even though some of this work was mop-up duty here, where they were getting destroyed by 2 or 3 touchdowns most of the way. But he finished in week 4 versus Seattle, 157 passing yards, 2 touchdowns passing, 7 rush attempts, 41 yards and a 2-point conversion. And in week 5 at Arizona, if he's going to start in this ball game, is Trey Lance. You know, this is a ball game where both teams put up points, and he's going to have to keep up with this high impact Arizona offense. So right here, if Lance is the starter, he's a must-add this week on the waiver wire. He's available in 70% of fantasy leagues. That's a few quarterbacks I would look to add on the waiver wire heading into week 5 of the fantasy football season.